The man who would become the terror of many an Englishman during the later 10th and early 11th centuries was born around 960 AD in what would become modern-day Denmark, the son of Harald Bluetooth, one of the first rulers in the area to accept baptism as a Christian, and likely a woman of common stock. Sweyn Forkbeard's father may not have been the first to be converted in his native land, but it was during his reign that the Christian religion more firmly took hold. The benefits of adopting this growing faith, such as the bureaucracy provided by the clergy, which helped to centralise power away from semi-independent nobles, was also weighed against the pressure of his southern neighbour Otto, the powerful Holy Roman Emperor to the south. Indeed, Otto was right to be pushy, given the rich religious heritage of his northern neighbours. Harald certainly did not have everything his own way in Christianising his own folk, his people clinging to the old gods. Harald's 3-decade or so reign certainly laid much of the groundwork to the full Christianisation of the area, but Harald's son, Sweyn, was a perfect example of the merging of these two worlds, and, though there is evidence he sponsored the building of several churches in Denmark, he was also no political ally of the Archbishopric of Hamburg-Bremen, and was, above all, an ambitious man who would perform very unchristian acts to achieve his will. Sweyn's father built up his kingdom that overcame many of the smaller petty kingdoms that competed with it on the Jutland Peninsula and the surrounding islands. He was also responsible for the famous fort at Trelleborg, and yet even this and other fortifications were not enough to overcome his greatest threat, his own son, Sweyn. Stepping back a moment, Sweyn could boast a line of descent to the earlier Danish monarch, Gorm the Old, his paternal grandfather. Gorm himself was said to be the son of semi-legendary Danish ruler Harthacnut, son of Sigurd Snake in the Eye, another semi-legendary Danish chieftain, who was in turn the supposed son of Ragnar Lothbrok himself, one of the first Danes to terrorise England in the early Viking Age. Sweyn was likely fully aware of this pedigree, steeping him in the seafaring culture that had over the previous decades met with decline in England. Danish power in England surged to a peak during the middle 9th century, with the landing of the Great Heathen Army in 865 and the subsequent conquest of all the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, that is, all but one. The Danes had carved significant kingdoms and territories out of the corpse of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms of East Anglia, Mercia and Northumbria, but had failed to crush Wessex, the most powerful of them. Indeed, in the long term, it was King Guthrum's failure to subdue King Alfred's realm in 878 AD that directly led to the long fight back that would culminate with the establishment of a united Anglo-Saxon kingdom under Alfred's grandson, Æthelstan, in 927 AD. Despite Guthrum's loss to Alfred at Edington and the subsequent treaty that divided what would become England between Danish and English spheres, Alfred's son Edward, known as the Elder, succeeded Alfred in 899 and, along with his sister Æthelflæd, led the Anglo-Saxon reconquest of all the Danish settlements, including East Anglia and the 5 boroughs, so that by the end of the Elder's reign, only the Viking kingdom of York remained. The full reconquest was completed by Edward's son Æthelstan in 927, with Alfred's grandson seizing the kingdom of York on the death of Sihtric, though not before driving off a challenge from the Norse king Guthrum. Though York and Northumbria were by no means fully cooperative subjects of their new southern overlords, and Æthelstan's successors even lost the territory for a time, the Kingdom of England was all but formed. A series of short reigns led to the golden age of Edgar the Peaceful, who, as his name suggests, presided over a relative period of peace and prosperity from the Viking menace. Edgar reigned from 959 to 975, the descendant of one of the Elder's younger sons. But though Edgar's was a good era for the English, his early death at around aged 32 would provide the opening for a Danish resurgence. 975 had initially seen Edgar's elder son Edward ascend to the throne. However, the young king quickly hemorrhaged support and was ultimately betrayed and murdered, most likely on the orders of Elfrith, mother of Edgar's other son, Ethelred, and the Queen Dowager, and thus became known to history as the Martyr. If this bloody beginning to his reign was less than ideal, it certainly mirrored the internal and external struggles to come. By 991, Danish raids had become more frequent, with the young king unable to stem the violence. In the summer of 991, a large fleet of dragon-headed longboats appeared off of the Suffolk coast and ultimately carried a horde of Vikings to the battlefield of Malden. Under the likely leadership of Olaf Tryggvason, future king of Norway, the invaders were allowed to stream over the narrow spit from their island base to fight and defeat the men of Björnfloth, Ealdorman of Essex. Following this defeat, King Ethelred was persuaded by Sigeric, Archbishop of Canterbury, to pay off Olaf and his horde. This had been a policy even of the great Alfred in his darkest hours earlier in his reign, and obviously seemed the most expedient solution given the circumstances, with Sigeric himself also paying a geld to avoid the destruction of his own cathedral later on in 994. However, appeasement without teeth merely led to more attacks. The first payment was £10,000, a colossal sum. To think of these series of raids, at least early on, as a concerted and collective effort is erroneous, given that the men in these raids were of Danish, Norse, and sometimes Swedish origin. These northern lands were hardly unified and homogeneous entities themselves, as is shown by events. For example, Malden was likely fought against Norse warriors, whereas King Sweyn, our subject of today, and King Ethelred's later nemesis, was a Dane. These early raids were opportunistic, more than a serious attempt at conquest, which may explain the king's willingness to adopt this old method of appeasement. However, with each new and increased payment grew the likelihood that more would come, hungry to extract more wealth from this weak kingdom. The logic too was that why simply extract the milk once, or even a few times, when you could simply take the cow? In this spirit, the Vikings were back again in 995. On September 8th, the Nativity of St. Mary, they bore down on London with 100 ships, though the battle was inconclusive. Sweyn's early raids did not achieve much, though he seemingly held all the advantages. The long coastline of Britain was difficult to effectively defend at the best of times, and these were not England's best times. Sweyn operated from a wide range of support too, from Viking settlements on Ireland, such as Dublin, to Normandy, a province of France under the direct control of the descendants of Vikings. But in setting the scene in England, the venue of arguably Sweyn's greatest triumph, I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. Though Sweyn would almost certainly have enjoyed tales and songs of his Viking ancestors' deeds, he would also have been acutely aware of the shifting religious and political dynamics that having the powerful Otto the Great to the south of his father's domain dictated. The Holy Roman Empire was a reality that could scarcely be ignored, the southern lands of the Jutland Peninsula being a contested area, with Otto's domain roughly corresponding to modern-day Germany, down to the northern parts of Italy. Otto was a pious yet militant ruler, crowned Emperor of the Romans by Pope John XII in 962. Otto was not shy in pushing his faith's boundaries too, perhaps providing food for thought for Sweyn's father, Harald. To offset any military designs Otto may have had on his own lands, Harald smartly converted to Christianity in 965, though significantly offering his son Sweyn for baptism too, the latter taking the name Otto. Harald further placated Otto by building churches in his realm, thus staying above suspicion, while also allowing missionaries from the Bremen region to enter his kingdom to speed on the conversion of the populace. What the young Sweyn thought or later thought of this as he matured from infant convert to hardened warrior will forever be lost to history. Not much is known of these formative years, though it's certain he would have received an education standard for boys of his class, learning farming management, skills of war and seamanship, which would prove staples in his later career. What we do know is that Harald's Christianizing efforts, even if only enacted through political necessity, were not universally embraced by the nobility and Danish people at large, providing a possible avenue of support for any opposition to the king, as prominent men resented these churches and missionaries as affronts to their core beliefs, which they had held for centuries. Yet if Harald had, on the surface, been fully embraced into the bosom of the church, he certainly didn't allow this to blunt his military ambitions. The king conquering Norway in 970, or at least the southeast of the area known as Norway today, known as Vik. This new region became the northernmost of Harald's territories, was placed under the stewardship of Hakon Sigurdsson, who ruled the province as Harald's vassal. Yet Norway was not the only hotspot, given that in 973 Otto I died, leaving his equally militant son, another Otto, on the throne of the Holy Roman Empire. Otto II struck by targeting the rich town of Hedeby, a hub of regional trade, in 974 in response to Harald's own opportunistic attacks on Saxony in the immediate aftermath of Otto the Great's death. Otto II met the Danish king's forces at the Danework, or Danevik, which was a series of walls and trenches stretching along the neck of the Cimbrian peninsula. Though Otto could not smash directly through the fortifications, he did keep up a frontal attack to distract Harald's men long enough to enable a separate landing to the north. This fresh attack spelling defeat and the loss of Hedeby and perhaps other territories too. This defeat for Harald was significant given its wider implications. Harald would eventually reclaim Hedeby and the lost territories towards the end of his reign in 983, but in the meantime his own grip on power was severely compromised and the prospects of his son Sweyn strengthened. But why was this? Well, as with many royal father-son relationships throughout history, Harald and Sweyn's was frosty to say the least. Given his state-building and furious efforts to secure his own power at home, it's likely Harald had little time for his son. The relationship too was strained due to personality differences. Sweyn is known to have been colourful, charismatic and popular among the people, in contrast to his sterner father, who was perhaps constrained in his conduct through realpolitik, necessarily extorting greater sums of money, labour and resources from his subjects to fund the extensive building of fortifications and churches. A huge setback in the aftermath of 974 was the alienation of Hakon Sigurdsson, Harald's regent in Norway. Hakon, like many of Harald's subjects close to home, was an adherent of the old gods. Though he had dutifully travelled south to fight the Germans with his king, he was compelled as part of the peace to reject the Norse gods in favour of the Christian god. To rub salt into this bitter wound, Hakon was also forced to ferry German missionaries back north with him to begin mass conversions of his subjects. Hakon, as you may have guessed, feigned acceptance enough to regain direct control of Vik before renouncing both Harald and his religion, even sending the missionaries out of his domain. In addition, he severed political ties, even refusing tribute to the battered Harald. With the de facto loss of Norway and its revenues, as well as the mounting pressure coming from the empire to his south, Harald's final years must have been strained to say the least. Throw into all this the prime subject of our video, Sweyn. Around 974-5, he would have been around 15 years old. As aforementioned, Sweyn's relationship with his father appears to have been tense. The later work commissioned by Sweyn's daughter-in-law, Emma of Normandy, the Encomium Emmae Reginae, states that Sweyn was universally loved, that is, bar one, Harald, who apparently hated the boy. Perhaps in an attempt to put some distance between him and his subjects, or even simply to prepare his son for his eventual succession, Harald sent the young Sweyn to the famed Jomsvikings under their chieftain, Palna Toki, on the island of Finn. These Jomsvikings had a legendary reputation as warriors and mercenaries, and were heavily dedicated to the worship of the old gods, yet not so picky as to reject payment from Christian rulers wishing to purchase their deadly services. Given their reputation and exorbitant fees, it's no surprise that they were highly selective in whom they admitted to their ranks, with only the best warriors considered, and even when accepted, held to a strict code of conduct. One vow they made was to pursue vengeance ruthlessly and relentlessly for the fall of a brother, and never to retreat from battle unless overwhelmed. Such an apprenticeship then must have forged the young Dane into a formidable fighter in his own right, while developing those tactical and seamanship skills that would raise him to greatness. At least it would have proved challenging to the boy, and a stark contrast perhaps to the Christian culture and lackeys surrounding his father back home. Eventually Sweyn was even permitted formal entry into the order, though this could never have been a permanent arrangement given his place as his father's heir. It was likely too around this time that Sweyn took on the name he would forever be associated with, Forkbeard, following the long Viking tradition of taking a name based on physical attributes. Given Sweyn's brash and colourful personality, in contrast to his father's more stern and authoritarian style, it's not too far-fetched to picture the bearded young Sweyn styling his appearance to such fashion. Like Hakon in Norway and others under Harald's rule, Palnatoke and his order, though initially supportive, began to drift in their allegiance, the religious differences driving a dangerous wedge between them. This was not isolated to the two men, with Sweyn's relationship with his father only worsening as he entered into his early 20s. The encomium Mi Reginae states that, as Sweyn matured into manhood and his personal popularity grew, that his father grew more resolved to deny him of the rule of Denmark, which may have prompted the coming storm. It wasn't difficult for Sweyn to stoke up the fires of rebellion, given the widespread resentment at Harald's religious policies. The young pretender even supported by his foster father, Palnatoke. It was around the mid-980s that Sweyn openly revolted against his father. According to Adam of Bremen, Sweyn plotted with some of the leading men of his father's kingdom who had not taken too kindly to being forced to abandon their old gods. This strategy seems logical and natural to an ambitious man seeking to oust his aging father, to ramp up the religious tensions of his father's subjects during a time of religious transition. The strategy worked, yet Harald had not built his formidable kingdom by being weak and still had some fight left in him. As Sweyn declared openly against him, Harald too raised his own force to counter his wayward son, with the king perhaps even enjoying numerical superiority, though not the support of Palnatoke and his elite Jomsvikings. As befitting a Viking family feud, the key battle of the conflict occurred at sea, within the fjord of Ise, within the island of Zealand. In around 986, Sweyn and his allies zeroed in on his father, Sweyn smashing directly through his father's longship. The fighting was brutal, the clash of swords and axes ringing through the icy air. Though the battle ground on, the ships entangling amidst the cries of wounded and dying, the battle itself may have been a straight-up draw if things had carried on like this, though this was not to be. Harald Bluetooth was struck several times in the carnage, prompting his men to wrest him from the battle and providing the strategic victory for Sweyn. Thus, as an exile among the Slavs, Bluetooth died of his wounds, was later buried back in his native Denmark. Now Sweyn, as the only viable candidate, was declared king of both Denmark and Norway. Strangely, it's at this point that perhaps Sweyn's greatest ally, Palnatoke, disappears from history, though it's not stated definitively that he fell in battle. Indeed, one account has him wounding King Harald himself with a well-placed arrow shot to the arse, though it's also known that he was succeeded in leadership of the order by Sigvaldi Strut Haraldsson around this time. Whatever the case, Sweyn's victory was complete, and he held a great feast to celebrate his succession, taking his father Bluetooth's throne and vowing, according to the saga of Olaf Tryggvason, to sail to England with his men and kill the cowardly King Ethelred himself. At the same time, Sigvaldi made his own ambitious vow to take on the treacherous Hakon Sigurdsson. With around 60 ships transporting about 6,000 warriors, Sigvaldi sailed north, though this encounter would see the reputation of the Jomsvikings dented somewhat. Hakon mustered his own formidable force along with the Jarls of Lade, putting to sea twice as many ships and around 10,000 men. In the resulting battle of Hjongavir, nature herself seemed to be against the invaders. As Sigvaldi's force descended on Hakon's fleet, a vicious hailstorm hit the faces of the Joms, the winds breaking up the attackers' formations and allowing the larger Norwegian force to take the day. 986 then proved a mixed year of fortunes for the new Danish king. He had wrenched the throne from his father, but had failed to correct the succession of Hakon. The Battle of Hjongavir merely tightening his grip on the territory. This was not Sweyn's only setback, though around this time he also secured a marriage with Gunhild of Wenden, Polish princess. Sweyn did have two sons, Harald and Cnut, who Gunhild soon after likely bore. In the first tentative years of his reign, Sweyn continued his father's policy of building churches to placate the wrath of the Holy Roman Empire, though it's likely he was softer in his pressure for his subjects to convert, given how that had turned out for his father. Another matter of concern that may have been a particular bone of contention for his Danish subjects was the specific issue of German clergy wielding political as well as religious influence in their lands. Bluetooth had allowed this as a matter of political necessity. However, Sweyn found a middle ground by replacing these Germans with his own crop of Anglo-Danish clergy. Many Danes still resided after several generations in this land, despite the Anglo-Saxon reconquest, and provided a ready-made pool of clerical recruitment. This policy thus enabled Sweyn to claim he was still adhering to the cultural and religious duties of Christianising his people, while having men more politically neutral, or at least unaligned with the German Church to the south. However, such a policy was bound to grate against chroniclers like Adam of Bremen, who naturally opposed such a move. Indeed, Adam of Bremen himself likely smiled to report that in around the year of 990, things only got worse for the new Danish king. Perhaps partly due to his policy of replacing German clergymen, as well as his more lax and anti-German stance generally, the coalition forced him from power to the favour of Eric the Victorious, King of Sweden, who held Denmark for some time, or at least parts of it. Eric achieved this through several sea battles, and thus Sweyn began a period of exile or partial rule, first making his way to Norway and then to England. Yet he was soon driven from there too, settling instead in Scotland for a time. It was this time of exile that forged him into the wily and hardened warrior that we all know. Indeed, the encomium, later written for his son's Queen Emma, states that Sweyn did everything he could to keep his men alert, becoming the very reincarnation of an old-style Viking raider. However, not all historians accept Adam of Bremen's account of Sweyn's movements. What is known is that Sweyn did reclaim his throne at some point. Some of the earliest coins minted from the region bear Sweyn's name, and were clearly modelled on the coins of King Ethelred's kingdom across the North Sea. Yet Sweyn's fall and his spectacular rise to effective overlord of the Viking world, as well as England, is a story for another video that deserves extensive exploration in its own right. So stay tuned for that, and I shall see you next time.